The name Lindsey Halligan has become synonymous with controversy, but what she just revealed in a federal courtroom has sent shockwaves through the entire legal establishment. This isn't just another political scandal. This is about the fundamental integrity of our justice system, and the explosive admission she made has left seasoned attorneys questioning everything they thought they knew about federal prosecutions. My friends, what you're about to hear will challenge your understanding of how justice works in America. We're talking about a prosecutor who went from beauty pageant contestant to one of the most powerful legal positions in the country, only to find herself at the center of allegations that could redefine prosecutorial misconduct. The revelation she made under oath has created what legal experts are calling an unprecedented constitutional crisis. But before we dive into the bombshell admission that has the legal world in chaos, let me give you the full picture of how we got here. Because this story involves grand jury manipulation, disappearing text messages, and what critics are calling the weaponization of federal prosecutions. Everything I'm about to tell you is documented, verified, and frankly, more shocking than any political thriller Hollywood could produce. In this explosive investigation, I'm going to walk you through the 3 most damaging revelations that have emerged about Lindsey Halligan's conduct as a federal prosecutor. First, the courtroom admission that has defense attorneys arguing entire indictments are invalid. Second, the secret communications that violated basic prosecutorial ethics. And third, the judicial findings that suggest fundamental legal errors were made during grand jury proceedings. What makes this story even more extraordinary is the timeline. We're talking about a prosecutor who had 0 prosecutorial experience before being handed one of the most powerful legal positions in America. Within days of her appointment, she was bringing charges against high-profile political figures, despite career prosecutors recommending against these very same prosecutions. Let me start with the most explosive revelation. On November 19th, during what should have been a routine court hearing, Lindsey Halligan made an admission that sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom. She revealed that the full grand jury that indicted former FBI Director James Comey never actually saw the final indictment. Only the 4-person and 1 other grand juror reviewed the charging document that was ultimately filed. Think about what this means for a moment. Grand juries are supposed to be the cornerstone of our criminal justice system. They exist to ensure that prosecutors can't simply file charges without proper oversight. The entire grand jury is supposed to review and approve the indictment before it becomes official. But according to Halligan's own testimony, that didn't happen in this case. Here's how this unprecedented situation unfolded. The grand jury originally considered 3 counts against Comey, but only approved 2 of them. Instead of going back to the full grand jury with a revised indictment, Halligan simply took the altered version directly to the magistrate's courtroom. She had only the 4-person and 1 other juror sign off on the final charging document. Defense attorney Michael Dreeben immediately seized on this revelation, arguing to the judge that no valid indictment exists. His exact words were chilling for prosecutors everywhere. "There is no indictment," he declared, adding that the statute of limitations has now elapsed on the charges against Comey. This isn't just a procedural error. Legal experts are calling this a fundamental violation of grand jury protocols that could invalidate the entire case. Federal Judge Michael Nachmanoff, who is overseeing the proceedings, now faces the unprecedented question of whether an indictment can be valid when the full grand jury never approved the final version. But the courtroom revelation was just the beginning. What emerged next was even more troubling for anyone concerned about prosecutorial ethics and independence. Halligan had been directly communicating with journalists about active cases she was prosecuting, using encrypted messaging apps with disappearing messages. The journalist Anna Bauer revealed that Halligan had reached out to her via text message about the prosecution of New York Attorney General Letitia James. The first message was direct and confrontational. "Anna, Lindsey Halligan here. You are reporting things that are simply not true. Thought you should have a heads up." What makes this communication so problematic isn't just that a federal prosecutor was directly contacting a journalist about an active case. It's that Halligan had set her messaging app to make all messages disappear after 8 hours, suggesting an attempt to avoid creating a permanent record of the conversation. This behavior violates multiple Department of Justice protocols about media engagement. Federal prosecutors are supposed to maintain strict confidentiality about ongoing investigations and communicate with the press only through designated channels and procedures. By reaching out directly to a journalist and using disappearing messages, Halligan stepped outside established norms and potentially compromised the perception of prosecutorial independence. Legal experts noted that such direct, informal contact with journalists about active grand jury cases is highly unusual and potentially problematic. The use of disappearing messages raised additional questions about adherence to department record-keeping rules and transparency requirements. But perhaps the most damaging findings came from the bench itself. Federal Judge William Fitzpatrick issued a scathing ruling that identified what he called fundamental misstatements of the law that Halligan made during her grand jury presentation. In his written decision, Judge Fitzpatrick described one of these errors as a fundamental and highly prejudicial misstatement of the law that suggests to the grand jury that Mr. Comey does not have a Fifth Amendment right not to testify at trial. The judge noted that this misstatement was made in response to challenging questions from grand jurors, in a context that could have led them to believe that Comey could be compelled to testify. The prosecutor is supposed to be the grand jury's legal advisor, providing accurate guidance about the law as they consider whether to approve charges. When that prosecutor makes fundamental errors about basic constitutional rights, it undermines the entire integrity of the process. Judge Fitzpatrick identified at least 2 instances of such legal misstatements, describing them as potentially compromising the integrity of the grand jury process. These aren't minor procedural errors or matters of legal interpretation. These are what the judge characterized as fundamental mistakes about well-established legal principles. The judicial criticism didn't stop there. Judge Fitzpatrick also raised concerns about whether Comey's indictment was properly presented to the grand jury, noting that the court was in uncharted legal territory, because the indictment filed in open court may not have been the same charging document that the grand jury actually deliberated upon. Another magistrate judge described what he called a disturbing pattern of profound investigative missteps, representing an extraordinary judicial rebuke of a federal prosecutor's conduct. Such criticism from the bench is rare and suggests serious concerns about the quality and integrity of the prosecution. These judicial findings become even more significant when you consider Halligan's background. She had no prosecutorial experience before being appointed to one of the most important U.S. attorney positions in the country. Her previous work was in insurance law, representing residential and commercial property claims. The path from insurance lawyer to federal prosecutor is virtually unprecedented, especially for someone taking on high-profile political cases. Most U.S. attorneys have extensive prosecutorial experience, often spending years as assistant U.S. attorneys before being considered for leadership positions. Career prosecutors within the Eastern District of Virginia reportedly recommended against bringing the charges that Halligan ultimately filed. According to sources familiar with the internal deliberations, experienced prosecutors who had investigated both Comey and James advised that the cases were not supportable under existing legal standards. The decision to override these career prosecutors' recommendations raises fundamental questions about prosecutorial independence and the politicization of federal law enforcement. When experienced prosecutors who have spent years investigating a case advise against charges, Their judgment typically carries significant weight in prosecutorial decision-making, but Halligan's appointment came at a particularly charged moment. President Trump had publicly demanded action against both Comey and James, posting on social media that Attorney General Pam Bondi should act now to prosecute these individuals. The timing of these posts, coming just days before the indictments were filed, has created what defense attorneys argue is compelling evidence of political interference. The sequence of events reads like a roadmap of potential prosecutorial misconduct. First, Trump publicly demands prosecutions of his political opponents. Then, the existing U.S. attorney who had overseen the investigations is forced out of his position. Next, an inexperienced prosecutor with personal ties to Trump is installed in the role. Finally, within days of her appointment, charges are filed against the very individuals Trump had demanded be prosecuted. This timeline has prompted the legal watchdog group Campaign for Accountability to file formal complaints with both the Florida Bar and Virginia State Bar, seeking investigations into Halligan's conduct. The complaints accuse her of violating numerous rules of professional conduct, including filing charges without probable cause and making false statements to courts. Michelle Cuppersmith, the executive director of Campaign for Accountability, didn't mince words in her assessment. She described Halligan's actions as single-handedly undermining, maybe irrevocably, the public's confidence in the impartiality of the Department of Justice. The complaint alleges that Halligan was installed specifically to bring prosecutions that career prosecutors had deemed inappropriate. The ethical violations alleged against Halligan extend beyond just the decision to file charges. The complaints detail a pattern of behavior that legal experts say reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of prosecutorial responsibilities and ethical obligations. One of the most serious allegations involves her communication with journalists about active cases. Federal prosecutors are bound by strict rules about discussing ongoing investigations, particularly those involving grand jury proceedings. The use of encrypted messaging apps with disappearing messages suggests an awareness that such communications were inappropriate, yet a willingness to engage in them anyway. The implications of these revelations extend far beyond Halligan's individual conduct. They strike at the heart of public confidence in the federal justice system and raise questions about whether prosecutorial decisions are being made based on legal merit or political considerations. Legal scholars have noted that the independence of federal prosecutors is essential to maintaining the rule of law. When prosecutors appear to be acting at the behest of political figures rather than following established legal standards, it undermines the entire foundation of equal justice under law. The grand jury irregularities revealed in Halligan's testimony present particularly troubling questions about the validity of federal indictments. If prosecutors can bypass full grand jury review by simply having documents signed by individual jurors, it fundamentally alters the protective function that grand juries are supposed to serve. Constitutional law experts have described this situation as unprecedented in federal criminal procedure. The grand jury system has been a cornerstone of American criminal justice since the founding of the Republic, serving as a check on prosecutorial power by requiring citizen review of proposed charges. When that system is circumvented or manipulated, it raises profound questions about due process and the rights of defendants. If indictments can be obtained without proper grand jury review, then the protective barrier between citizens and potential government overreach has been seriously compromised. The judicial criticism of Halligan's legal knowledge adds another layer of concern. Federal prosecutors wield enormous power, including the ability to seek lengthy prison sentences and impose significant financial penalties on defendants. When those prosecutors lack basic understanding of constitutional rights and legal procedures, the potential for injustice increases dramatically. The misstatements about Fifth Amendment rights that Judge Fitzpatrick identified are particularly concerning because they go to the core of constitutional protections. The right against self-incrimination is fundamental to our adversarial legal system, and prosecutors who misunderstand or misrepresent these rights can seriously prejudice grand jury deliberations. Defense attorneys in both the Comey and James cases have seized on these revelations to challenge the validity of the entire prosecutions. They argue that the combination of political interference, procedural irregularities, and legal errors has so tainted these cases that they cannot proceed. The broader implications of this controversy extend to other federal prosecutions as well. If prosecutors in one district are found to have engaged in such serious misconduct, it raises questions about oversight and accountability throughout the federal system. Congressional Republicans who have generally supported Trump's calls for investigations of his political opponents now find themselves in the uncomfortable position of defending prosecutorial conduct that even conservative legal scholars have criticized as problematic. Meanwhile, Democratic lawmakers are calling for congressional hearings and Department of Justice investigations into Halligan's appointment and subsequent actions. They argue that the integrity of federal law enforcement depends on ensuring that prosecutorial decisions are made independently and based on legal merit rather than political considerations. The personal dimension of this controversy has also drawn attention. Halligan's recent marriage and attempts to present a more relatable public image stand in stark contrast to the serious professional allegations she faces. Critics argue that personal charm and relatability cannot substitute for prosecutorial competence and ethical behavior. The question now becomes whether the federal justice system has adequate mechanisms to address prosecutorial misconduct of this magnitude. Bar discipline proceedings can take years to resolve, and even successful complaints typically result only in professional sanctions rather than criminal consequences. Sanctions rather than criminal consequences. The immediate question facing the courts is whether these prosecutions can continue given the procedural violations and legal errors that have been documented. Defense attorneys are filing motion after motion, each one chipping away at the foundation of cases that were already built on questionable legal ground. What's particularly striking about this situation is how it exposes the vulnerability of our entire prosecutorial system. When someone with minimal experience can be placed in such a powerful position and immediately begin making decisions that career prosecutors advised against. It reveals fundamental flaws in how we select and oversee federal prosecutors. The ripple effects are already being felt throughout the legal community. Other federal prosecutors are reportedly concerned that the Halligan controversy will undermine public confidence in prosecutorial independence more broadly. When one prosecutor's conduct becomes so problematic that it generates national headlines and judicial rebukes, it reflects poorly on the entire profession. Legal ethics professors are now using the Halligan case as a teaching example of how not to conduct federal prosecutions. The combination of political pressure, procedural shortcuts, and legal errors creates what they describe as a perfect storm of prosecutorial misconduct. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of this entire saga is what it reveals about the current state of our justice system. The fact that someone could be appointed to such a crucial position without the qualifications typically required suggests that political considerations may be overriding merit-based selection processes. The speed with which Halligan moved to file charges after her appointment also raises questions about whether adequate investigation and legal review took place. Career prosecutors typically spend months or even years building cases, carefully reviewing evidence and legal theories before seeking indictments. When charges are filed within days of a new prosecutor taking office, especially against high-profile political figures, it suggests that the decision-making process may have been driven by factors other than careful legal analysis. This is particularly concerning when the charges involve complex legal questions and politically sensitive defendants. The encrypted messaging revelations add another layer of troubling behavior. The use of disappearing messages suggests an awareness that the communications were inappropriate, yet a willingness to engage in them anyway. This kind of behavior is particularly problematic for a federal prosecutor, who should be setting the highest standards for legal and ethical conduct. Federal prosecutors are supposed to be above reproach, conducting themselves with the utmost integrity and transparency. When they engage in secretive communications about active cases, it undermines the public trust that is essential to the effective functioning of our justice system. The judicial findings about legal errors during grand jury proceedings are perhaps the most damaging revelations from a professional standpoint. Grand jury presentations require prosecutors to provide accurate legal guidance to citizen jurors who are relying on that expertise to make informed decisions about whether charges should be filed. When prosecutors make fundamental errors about basic legal principles during these presentations, it corrupts the entire process. The grand jurors are not lawyers and depend on the prosecutor to accurately explain the relevant law as they consider the evidence. The misstatements about Fifth Amendment rights that Judge Fitzpatrick identified are particularly egregious because they involve core constitutional protections that every prosecutor should understand thoroughly. These aren't obscure legal technicalities, but fundamental principles that form the foundation of our criminal justice system. The fact that multiple judges have now criticized Halligan's conduct suggests that these aren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of problematic behavior. Federal judges are typically reluctant to publicly criticize prosecutors, making their written rebukes even more significant. The broader constitutional questions raised by this controversy extend beyond Halligan's individual conduct to fundamental issues about prosecutorial power and accountability. The grand jury system exists as a check on prosecutorial authority, ensuring that charges can't be filed without citizen review and approval. When that system is bypassed or manipulated, it removes an important protection against prosecutorial overreach. The revelation that full grand juries may not have reviewed final indictments strikes at the heart of this protective function. Legal scholars are now debating whether existing oversight mechanisms are adequate to prevent this kind of prosecutorial misconduct. The current system relies heavily on self-regulation by prosecutors and their offices, with limited external oversight except in cases of clear criminal behavior. The bar complaint process, while important, typically takes years to resolve and focuses primarily on professional discipline rather than addressing the immediate harm caused by prosecutorial misconduct. By the time bar proceedings conclude, cases may have been resolved and defendants may have suffered significant consequences from improper prosecutions. The Lindsey Halligan revelations have exposed cracks in our justice system that cannot be ignored. From grand jury manipulation to encrypted communications with journalists, from fundamental legal errors to the apparent weaponization of prosecutorial power, this case represents everything that's wrong with how justice is administered in America today. The question now isn't whether Halligan will face consequences for her conduct, but whether our system has the strength to hold powerful prosecutors accountable when they abuse their authority. This story is far from over, and the implications will reshape how we think about prosecutorial independence for years to come.